Chagwera. Abambe. Chagwera. Kabambe. Tariga.
When Malawians went to the polls, they expected clarity. Instead, they got chaos. The president is on the ropes, the results are stuck in limbo, and both sides are already claiming victory. What should have been a democratic milestone has turned into a dangerous waiting game, and the whole nation is holding its breath. But what is really going on? Let us try to give you some clarity. Elections in Malawi have never been just about choosing a leader. They are a national reckoning, a mirror held up to the government, and often a desperate cry for survival. On September 16, 2025, millions of Malawians turned out under the blistering sun, some lining up before dawn, clinging to the belief that one mark on a ballot could bend history in their favor. The atmosphere in cities like Lilongwe and Blantyre was charged not with celebration, but with fatigue. Inflation had eaten away at salaries for years, food prices doubled, and fuel queues stretched longer than some of the voting lines. For many, casting a vote wasn't about endorsing a politician. It was about punishing the one they blamed for their hardship. The incumbent president, Lazarus Chakwera, entered this election with heavy baggage. His promise of a new Malawi after the annulled 2019 elections and his sweeping win in 2020 had raised expectations sky high. But 5 years later, disappointment hung in the air like a fog. Jobs hadn't materialized, corruption scandals resurfaced, and austerity measures made life harder. The ruling party urged patience, insisting structural reforms take time, but hungry families don't live on reforms. They live on food that is increasingly out of reach. For rural farmers battered by climate shocks, and for urban workers watching their paychecks shrink to dust, the slogan of patience had worn thin. On the other side of the ballot stood Peter Mutharika, the former president who had been ejected from office by a court ruling 5 years earlier. His campaign leaned heavily on nostalgia and resentment. He presented himself as the leader who had been wrong, the man whose victory was stolen in 2019, now returned to reclaim what was his. His rallies were fueled less by policy than by raw emotion. A mixture of loyalty, tribal identity, and the yearning to turn back the clock to better days. For his supporters, this election was not merely about policy failures, it was about redemption, about restoring what they believed was unjustly taken. Caught between these two figures were millions of citizens who no longer trusted either side completely. A rising chorus of younger voters, many of whom had only faint memories of Malawi's early democratic struggles in the 1990s, spoke with disillusionment. They asked what democracy meant if every election ended in chaos, if leaders changed, but poverty remained. For them, standing in the queue was less about belief in a brighter future and more about grim obligation. If you don't vote, you don't exist. By the afternoon, polling stations were buzzing with both hope and unease. Civil society monitors watched closely. International observers hovered, and whispers of irregularities began to circulate even before the ballots were sealed. But in that moment, the greater story wasn't fraud or delay. It was expectation. For many Malawians, the ballot box was not just a piece of paper. It was a weapon, the last defense against a political class that had failed to deliver. Yet expectation is a double-edged sword. When citizens pour all their frustrations into an election, when they see it as their final chance to be heard, what happens if the results don't match their hopes? When the promises collapse under the weight of reality, the line between democratic disappointment and outright rage becomes dangerously thin. And so, as the sun set on election day, Malawi stood on a knife's edge. The votes were cast, but the real question loomed. Could the system deliver results quickly enough to match the people's hunger for change? Or would hesitation and silence unravel the fragile trust holding the country together? That silence is where the chaos began, and it is exactly what we must turn to next. When the ballots were sealed and the last voters drifted away from the polling stations, Malawians waited for answers. Yet what came first wasn't clarity, but silence. Days passed, and the Malawi Electoral Commission MEC hesitated, insisting it was still verifying figures even after announcing that more than 99% of votes were counted. In theory, this was caution. In practice, silence in the middle of a high-stakes contest sounded like a ticking time bomb. For a population already distrustful of authority, every extra hour without results wasn't reassurance, it was provocation. Silence, in politics, is never neutral. In countries like Malawi, where history has taught citizens to be suspicious of authority, the absence of communication invites the worst assumptions. Was the commission simply double-checking numbers, or was it negotiating behind closed doors? Were ballots being protected in secure warehouses, or tampered with in the dark? Even the most routine delays were interpreted through a lens of betrayal, because the memory of manipulation was never far away. And as citizens debated these questions in crowded minibuses, in the markets and online, silence became louder than any official statement. For small traders and shop owners, the delay carried more than political consequences. It carried economic ones. Many held back on purchases, fearing instability would erupt if the announcement dragged on too long. Food vendors worried that unrest might scare away customers, while transport operators feared roadblocks if protests broke out. Malawi's fragile economy, already battered by inflation and shortages, does not tolerate uncertainty well. Every day without results was another day of economic slowdown, another signal to the people that the state was paralyzed. And it wasn't just the economy, it was also psychology. In rural villages, where radios are still the main source of news, farmers leaned into broadcasts, waiting for an announcement that never came. The repeated phrases, "still verifying, still consolidating," turned into a cruel ritual, heightening tension instead of diffusing it. The sense that something was being hidden grew stronger with every broadcast. In urban centers, young people turned to social media, where rumors spread far faster than verified updates. Screens lit up with claims of rigging, whispers of ballot theft, and warnings that the commission was buying time for one side to manipulate the count. Observers tried to intervene, with civil society urging patience and calm. International monitors repeated the mantra that verification is normal in a healthy democracy. But the words fell flat. In a country where the 2019 election had to be annulled, trust was not a luxury. It was already in deficit. Silence fed suspicion, and suspicion fed anger. What began as waiting turned into watching, and watching turned into agitation. The danger of such a vacuum is not just speculation, it is polarization. By leaving results hanging in limbo, the commission inadvertently gave political parties room to fill the gap with their own narratives. Supporters didn't just wait for an official announcement, they were primed to accept whatever story their leaders told them. And when silence lasts too long, stories harden into beliefs. By the end of the week, Malawi wasn't just waiting, it was simmering. Citizens no longer asked if results would come, but whose results would be accepted. Was the commission going to favor the ruling party? Was the opposition right to suspect foul play? Every rumor gained traction because the official channels provided no competing truth. In that silence, power slipped away from the hands of the Electoral Commission and into the mouths of politicians eager to shape reality. Which leads to the next turning point. When official silence becomes unbearable, who steps in to fill the void? Let's pause for a second to say, big thank you to the Black Culture Diary community, where Black voices, stories, and legacies are preserved and amplified. By becoming a member, you're not just supporting the channel, you're becoming part of a powerful cultural movement. Let's continue. When silence stretched too long, politicians moved quickly to weaponize it. If the Electoral Commission did not provide a winner, then the parties would. And so Malawi found itself in the strange position of having two presidents, one on paper, the other in waiting, both claiming victory before the official tally had even been released. The Democratic Progressive Party, DPP, led by Peter Mutharika, was first out of the gates. Pointing to partial results from just 9 of the 36 councils, the party declared that Mutharika had secured more than half the vote and was therefore the rightful winner. At rallies and press briefings, DPP officials repeated the same figure, 51%, as if it were gospel. It didn't matter that these results were incomplete or that other regions had not yet been counted. What mattered was perception. If enough people believed Mutharika had won, then contesting his claim would be painted as theft. Not to be outdone, Lazarus Chakwera's Malawi Congress Party, MCP, countered with its own version of reality. Officials pointed to the president's strongholds, arguing that votes from these areas were still being tallied and would swing the outcome in his favor. They framed the DPP's early declarations as reckless, even dangerous, but behind their warnings was the same intent: to convince supporters that Chakwera had the upper hand. This race to declare victory wasn't just about bravado, it was a calculated strategy. By shaping the narrative before official results were announced, both sides sought to inoculate their followers against disappointment. If the Electoral Commission later declared the other side the winner, supporters could say, "But we were told we had already won." Something must have been stolen. In this way, premature claims of victory acted as insurance policies against defeat. On the ground, the effect was immediate. Social media became a battlefield where competing hashtags, videos, and victory posters circulated like wildfire. In Blantyre, DPP supporters marched with banners declaring Mutharika the people's president, while in Lilongwe, MCP gatherings broke into chants celebrating Chakwera's certain re-election. Neither side was waiting for the referee to call the match. They had already rushed the field and hoisted their captain on their shoulders. The real tragedy was not the arrogance of leaders, but the vulnerability of ordinary Malawians caught in the middle. For many citizens, trust in institutions was already weak. Seeing both parties declare victory only confirmed their suspicion that elections are less about counting votes and more about who can shout the loudest. Farmers in the countryside and workers in cities weren't parsing council by council tallies. They were hearing their leaders assure them they had already won. And in an environment of scarcity and hardship, people cling to whatever certainty they are given. But premature victory is not harmless. It hardens divisions and raises the stakes dangerously high. Once a party convinces its followers that it has already secured a mandate, conceding becomes almost impossible. To admit defeat is no longer seen as respecting democracy. It is seen as betrayal. And when both camps frame any other outcome as illegitimate, the possibility of a peaceful transition narrows. This political brinkmanship also deepened the isolation of the Electoral Commission. Its cautious, bureaucratic language could not compete with the triumphant rhetoric of the parties. Instead of being the ultimate authority, the commission appeared sidelined, its credibility shrinking by the day. In effect, the politicians had hijacked the narrative and transformed the contest into one where official results mattered less than the strength of partisan conviction. By the time the week ended, Malawi was not waiting for results. It was waiting for confirmation of which victory would be allowed to stand. And in a country where history has shown that elections rarely end at the ballot box, another question began to surface. If both sides insist they have already won, who will the people turn to for the final word? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. When both parties crowned themselves winners, Malawians were reminded of an uncomfortable truth. This was not the first time the ballot had thrown the nation into turmoil. The present crisis echoed loudly against the backdrop of 2019, when Peter Mutharika was initially declared victorious, only for the Constitutional Court to step in and overturn the results months later. That ruling was historic, not just for Malawi, but for Africa. It was only the second time on the continent that a presidential election was annulled. Judges described irregularities so widespread they compromised the integrity of the entire process. Tally sheets tampered with, correction fluid masking numbers, and complaints ignored by electoral officials. At the time, many Malawians celebrated the annulment as proof that their democracy could correct itself. It showed that even a sitting president could be stripped of victory if the rules were broken. But while the judgment made history, it also planted seeds of doubt that remain today. If one election could be stolen or so badly mishandled, why not another? Instead of strengthening trust, the 2019 precedent left citizens permanently skeptical of official results. And in politics, skepticism can be as corrosive as outright fraud. The rerun in 2020 gave Lazarus Chakwera his landslide win, and for a moment the system looked redeemed. But redemption has a short shelf life when daily life does not improve. By 2025, many who once celebrated judicial courage now spoke bitterly about wasted years. They questioned whether annulling an election had really changed anything, or whether it had simply swapped one political elite for another. This lingering disillusionment meant that when delays and premature victory claims resurfaced, the shadow of 2019 loomed larger than ever. The courts, once celebrated, are now seen with mixed feelings. On one hand, they remain the final arbiter if disputes escalate. On the other, their independence is constantly questioned. Skeptics whisper about judicial appointments, about political influence behind closed doors, about whether the boldness shown in 2019 can be repeated when the stakes are even higher. Civil society urges calm, reminding people that the judiciary has proven its mettle before. But citizens scarred by economic hardship wonder whether another protracted legal battle will deliver bread to the table or simply more speeches from robed judges. What makes this haunting even more dangerous is the timing. Legal challenges take months. Malawi does not have the luxury of months. Inflation continues to squeeze households, fuel shortages persist, and the prospect of unrest already weighs on fragile supply chains. If this election also ends up in the courts, citizens fear a repeat of 2019. Long delays, endless hearings, and leaders more focused on litigation than governance. And while elites argue over legality, it is ordinary Malawians who pay the price through lost business, disrupted farming cycles, and food insecurity. International observers are keenly aware of these echoes of the past. Donor countries and organizations quietly remind Malawi that credibility matters not just for politics, but for aid, investment, and regional stability. A nation that replays the same crisis every 5 years risks being seen as permanently unstable. And once labeled unstable, doors begin to close. Investors hesitate, lenders raise interest rates, and even allies begin to doubt. In that sense, the ghost of 2019 is not only political, it is economic. This leaves Malawi in a bind. The courts may again be asked to decide who really won, but their intervention may heal or deepen the wound depending on how citizens perceive the process. If handled transparently, the judiciary could reaffirm its role as a guardian of democracy. But if seen as partial or slow, it could inflame frustrations beyond the point of control. And so the question now is not just about history, it is about survival. If the courts are dragged back into the arena, will they provide the certainty Malawians crave, or will they prolong the cycle of distrust? For ordinary Malawians, the chaos unfolding in the capital is not an abstract contest of legal briefs or press statements. It is a disruption that seeps into daily survival. In Blantyre's markets, traders raise prices not just because goods are scarce, but because uncertainty itself makes them scarce. Truckers transporting maize from rural areas slow their trips, fearing roadblocks or riots, and in doing so shrink supplies further. Families who live day-to-day on small incomes find themselves caught in a cruel spiral. Less food on the shelves, higher prices for what remains, and no guarantee of stability tomorrow. This is the cruel irony of democracy in crisis. When leaders bicker over ballots, citizens pay in bread, and Malawi is not in a position to absorb more shocks. Climate disasters have already battered agriculture, the country's lifeline. International creditors circle warily, demanding reforms before releasing funds, and donors, though sympathetic, are growing fatigued by a nation that seems to repeat the same cycle of political breakdown every election cycle. If this moment spirals, the damage will not be measured only in political legitimacy, but in the empty stomachs of millions. Yet this crisis is not merely a tragedy in the making, it is also a test. Malawi has arrived at a crossroads where two futures are possible. In the first, the Electoral Commission delivers a transparent, credible result that, though contested, holds enough weight to calm the streets. Leaders, though bruised, choose restraint over confrontation, and institutions regain some of the trust they have squandered. Such a scenario would not erase Malawi's economic troubles, but it would buy the country something far more valuable: stability, the condition upon which every reform, investment, and recovery depends. The second path is darker. If both parties double down on their premature declarations and refuse to accept any outcome that doesn't crown them victor, then the courts will inevitably be dragged back into the battlefield. But courts cannot conjure bread, and rulings cannot feed hungry families. A prolonged stalemate could ignite protests, trigger violent clashes, and fracture the already fragile confidence in Malawi's democratic project. Once citizens conclude that elections are little more than elite games, the very idea of democracy risks collapse. And in such a collapse, it is not institutions that crumble first, it is livelihoods. This is the edge Malawi now walks upon. One step could restore confidence, the other could plunge it into years of instability. The irony is that both Chakwera and Mutharika campaigned on promises of fixing the economy, yet their refusal to wait for due process may worsen the very hardship they pledged to end. For Malawians, the ballot box was meant to be a shield against hunger and poverty. Instead, it now threatens to become the sword that deepens them. Still, there is a sliver of hope. Malawi's citizens have shown resilience before, mobilizing peacefully to demand accountability, from the annulment of the 2019 elections to pushing for reforms that brought international respect. The same civic spirit could once again pressure leaders and institutions to act responsibly. But hope is not a plan, and resilience is not endless. If political elites continue to gamble with people's patience, the country's social fabric may stretch beyond repair. So as Malawi waits for results to be finalized, one question towers above all others. Will this election be remembered as the moment the nation restored faith in its fragile democracy, or as the moment it watched that democracy unravel under the weight of broken promises and deepening despair? The answer will define not just who governs next, but whether the ballot box can still be trusted to govern at all. Do you think Malawi's democracy will survive this storm? Let us know in the comments section. Should the courts decide who really won, or should the people take matters into their own hands? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.